My name is Chad Houck. I'm the Idaho Chief Deputy Secretary of State. I've been at the Capitol for just about 7.5 years now. Came in originally as a consultant, worked in the private industry fields for a number of years, and only more recently got into the government side. Before I was in government, I spent a lot of time looking at processes and systems, doing system analysis, doing process analysis, and trying to figure out how to fix broken things. And lo and behold, I ended up in government. So no irony lost there, I hope. But nonetheless, today what we're going to be looking at, if you can see the shared slides, we're talking about system and process definition and how critical it is, especially in an environment where we've been talking in elections of late. Thank you, Emmett. Of trying to deal with and counter a lot of distrust in the system. And you hear very common statements, the system is broken, or there's no integrity in elections, or any other number of comments that you can apply to your own field. In order to counter those, you have to be able to understand, be able to define what that system is. Before we dive too far into this, get going on the slides here. Let's take a quick look at where we're going in the next 45 minutes. First, we'll be talking about my overall point, especially if I can get my PowerPoints to keep up with me. So we're going through Zoom and coming back through, and I've got a lag. It's not working well.
No, that's, but I've seen the slide before.
You've seen the slide before? You've seen a slide before?
No, this kind of a lag.
That's going the wrong direction. All right, give me 30 seconds here. We'll see if I can even get out of the screen. Which arrow are you using? I'm trying to, right, it's just locked up. I can't even get the mouse to move on my screen. It's moving. So interesting. Okay, I got it there. There you go. Solve. Boom. All right, we're gonna not touch anything else. Just for some fun, since we're all adults, we're gonna look at distilling as an analogy for getting our definition in. And then finally, we'll take this and push it into the election space a little bit, since that is my area of expertise. We'll look at the US elections landscape. We'll look at some of the things and how we've put that in practice here at Boise State at the Insure Center, and then get into some summary and some Q&A. So now that we've got all the technical bugs figured out, a thorough definition as a necessity before we start looking at proposing or exploring solutions. I know when I was working on my master's, one of the most frustrating things that I encountered was when my advisors would say, yep, it's interesting information, narrow it down more. It's interesting information, but your scope's too broad. You've still got too much information in here. You haven't defined it well enough. And it was frustrating, but in the end, it was a really good lesson. It was a really good thing to learn. Here's a good framing one for it. Now, before you go looking up Robert A. Humphreys, to the best of my knowledge, he's not some infamous mathematician or anything else. This quote was on the inside of a green tea bottle. Okay? So don't go looking for it in some great philosophy books, but it does have a really good point. An undefined problem has an infinite number of solutions, and not all of them are good. There's solutions that are out there that are excessive, that are maybe inefficient, that we could zero out or that we could take away from the problem solving set if we just spend a little extra time defining, zeroing in on our actual problem and making sure that we're looking at the problem itself. If we take this into elections, you can't decide if an election system has integrity if you don't know what an election system is. I just recently had spine surgery. And I'm really glad that the doctors took enough time to define the actual root cause of the problem rather than just simply treating the system, simply treating the symptoms in the wrong system, even possibly. One of the symptoms I had is I had some numbness in the back of my leg. Well, you could think, well, that's a hamstring problem. Okay, let's just work on his hamstrings and go through months of PT on my hamstrings and never look at the right system. Fortunately, and I actually did that for a little while with some chiropractic and some other things. But then when we got into it a little bit more, what we found is that I actually had a vertebrae that had some discs above and below it that had compressed enough that that vertebrae was able to slide. And it wasn't until they were zeroing down on the fact that that vertebrae was out of place that we were able to figure out a way to fix it. And ultimately, the solution was pretty simple. They put a couple screws in, put a couple rods in. 4 days later, I'm up and walking again, normal, and I have no pain and I can bend. I'm really grateful that they took enough time to define the actual root cause of the issue in the process of getting to a solution, because all the other solutions might have gotten there, but literally we spent over 8.5 months trying to figure that out. And ultimately, in the end, it took a 4-hour surgery and a 4-day recovery. We're going to go over, let's look at distilling, just in case anybody enjoys distilled anything. Distilling as an analogy. When you distill something, what are some of the things you're doing? I'm going to rely on anyone in the room here. What do you do when you distill something?
Filter things out.
Filter things out. What else? It's a really good answer. You make something that's not necessarily all that desirable into something that, in many people's opinions, might be a little bit more desirable, right? Distilling is a process. How many people, anybody remember chemistry, how that process works? Okay. Jumping out of computer science a little bit, going into chemistry. You take something in a liquid form, you apply some heat underneath it, right? You get it up to a boiling point and it turns that heat or that liquid into a vapor. Vapor goes up, gets separated off, gets cooled, and becomes what's known as a distillate or distillate, depending on if you're British or not. And that cooled liquid that comes off, there's still liquid in the other bottle, but that cool liquid that comes off is purified. It's homogeneous at that point because it's a different solution or a different compound that's over there. But it's important to understand a couple of things when you go into distilling. One, distilling is going to get rid of any excess volume. We're taking a lot of something over here and we're reducing it to less of something of what we want on another side. We're reducing excess volume. It removes the unwanted, it purifies, it filters, like you said. It's going to isolate the things that we're looking for. And it's going to concentrate that result and make it that much more potent. That's an important thing to remember. And I think that's a really good way to look at actually getting in and zeroing in on your definition as we're looking at research. But there's some things that you have to do when you're gonna work in that space. First, you must understand the material components involved. When you're distilling something, you have to apply a certain amount of heat. But if you've got two different compounds and one boils at one temperature and one boils at another temperature, you have to hold it in between those two thresholds in order for the process to work. If you don't get it hot enough, the first compound won't boil off. If you get it too hot, the second compound starts to boil off as well, and now you've polluted your result. So you've got to stay within the margins. You've got to know and understand what you're working with, which again is another process of definition. You've got to thoroughly understand the components that you're dealing with. The second thing is that it requires a disruptive input. In this case, it requires heat, right? In a normal situation, you've got to put heat to something. Well, heat's caused by friction. Heat's caused by things breaking up. So you got to disrupt it. Something's got to be disrupted in your thought process, because whatever you've got, you have, because that's its normal state. You've got to disrupt its state in order to get it to break apart, in order to get that purification process we're looking for. Sometimes that's handing it to an editor. Sometimes that's handing it to a review board. Sometimes that's looking at it from a different perspective. Has anyone ever tested? There's a comment or a theory out there that's there's only but one truth. Okay, go with that. But if you change your perspective, can that one truth have different manifestations? If you take a soda can and you shine a light directly down on the top of it, what kind of shadow does it cast on the table? A circle. Take that same soda can, hold it up, and shine the light directly from the side of it. What kind of shadow does it cast on the wall? A rectangle. If the soda can is the truth, are both a rectangle and a circle a reasonable representation of the truth from two different perspectives? Absolutely. But the perspective is what matters. So get somebody that looks at it from something other than your perspective. If we're talking about how you're setting up your research paper, your thesis argument, whatever it is, as you're trying to define your problem, get someone with other than your perspective to help you filter it, disrupt it a little bit. Also important to understand with distilling, it can be an iterative process. Remember, we were talking about a bunch of compounds and the different heat thresholds. If you have three elements in your suspension and you want to distill off two of them, you could actually go through and heat it up enough to get the first and the second over, then take that and distill it again and only get one of the two and end up with three separate elements, distilling all of them out, potentially making all three of them valuable pieces of information. So it can be an iterative process. And then finally, distilling produces both waste and value in the same process. Yes, there are going to be things you're going to trim off, but as you're trimming that off, you're producing greater value with the things that you're left with. And ironically, in some cases, you never know if what you're trimming off might actually be the thing that's of value to another department, another student, another professor's project, because you may learn something that you don't need in the moment, but that someone else might. We've seen that here already with, for example, the Idaho state audits. We were going through and finding ways of doing audits that work, and we had to rely on some folks from the math department. We had to rely on folks from the computer science department to help us vet the processes that we were going to use to randomize the audit. And there were some things that we tried that we didn't like, and there were some things that we presented that didn't work. But what we ended up doing in the process is actually giving some good problems to the math department to have to play with, right? You never know, it can produce both waste and value, and you may be surprised which is which. All right, so with distilling in the back of our head, let's go and take a look at the elections landscape. This is not by any means a photo I created. This is actually a cover of Time magazine from back in 2020. But I think it does a good job of encapsulating just how chaotic elections has been. I mean, everybody can look in there and probably find something or someone or some photo of something that they associate with, that they remember, that causes a positive or negative emotion for them. For me, it's just all chaos. It reflects a period of my life where I didn't sleep a lot. But let's look at the elections landscape as a whole. One, it's highly decentralized. We have 50 states, all running different election systems. Okay, so when people talk about elections and integrity in the United States, right there, that should tell you that there's a lot of lack of definition in that argument, right? The election system's broken. Elections are all fraudulent. Well, it's not an election, it's 50 separate elections in 50 different states. And in Idaho, that then breaks down to 44 additional individual separate counties. And each one runs a different system. So how do you go in and manipulate from a computer standpoint, from a computer science standpoint, how do you manipulate all 44 of those with the same level of effectiveness, same level of efficiency? It's unreasonable. They're differentiated. The whole system is non-homogeneous. There's extensive investment that's been made. The United States has spent hundreds of millions of dollars since 2018 in developing election systems infrastructure. 2017, the Department of Homeland Security defined elections infrastructure as critical infrastructure, and as a result, started to make investments through the Election Assistance Commission that were then distributed down to the states, much of which has been distributed out to the counties and the local municipalities that actually run and operate elections across the country. And as I said, in every one of those locations, it's been done differently, but the key commonality is that tremendous amounts of money has been spent, tremendous amount of time has been invested in looking at processes, looking at systems, training personnel. There have been huge, huge investments made. There's a significant amount of misinformation that's out in the space. We'll touch on it here in a little bit, but we had a call the other day, and it was from a clerk wanting to know whether or not it was okay, whether they should allow, whether they should concede, because they want to counter the misinformation. They want to counter the distrust. They want to know if they should concede to allowing their ballots to be scanned by a forensic blacklight. Okay, because this particular individual believed that he would find the core, the root of all the fraud. Some of this misinformation, now mind you, that was the fraud in an election where when we went out and did an audit, we had 0.0006% margin of error. That's down in the thousands, right? But nonetheless, fraud's the mentality that fraud is prevalent still is out there, and in some people's minds is just self-perpetuating. Some of it's partisan, some of it's international. We know that we've had evidence of international meddling in elections, at least from the information side. We don't have any significant volume of evidence that shows that international actors have actually penetrated an actual election system and actually done anything to manipulate the data itself. We know that there are actors that have managed to gain access to systems, but never done so in a time that was critical. All right. So we got a lot of challenges there on the misinformation, and then ultimately we have a poor understanding amongst the populace of exactly what this system is. What does the system do? How is the system protected? So when you compound all of these challenges, you've got a pretty broad background that you have to try and paint your elections system on. So that's one of the things that we've tried to do here at Boise State is start to create some super high level commonalities that states can agree on, that they can start to define spaces where solutions can be placed. We're going to take a quick look at that.
Hey, Chad.
Yes, sir.
So when you say it's differentiated, systems are all different in all these states and counties. So is that just organic, or was that intentional?
I mean, that goes back to constitutionality. Those things not reserved to the federal government for itself were transferred as a value to the states. In the states, when the states decided whether or not they were when each state individually made the decision in their state constitution how they were going to run their elections, in some cases, they then pushed that out to the counties and the municipalities. In some cases, they put it into a board of elections, and that's run at the state level. So across the United States, we have what we call top-down and bottom-up organizational structures. Idaho runs from what we call a bottom-up. So we've got the main power and decision-making is vested in the counties at the county clerk level. We have centralized elections from there. So small taxing districts, water districts, sewer districts, they give their elections over to the county and agree for the exchange of not having to run that election themselves and bear that cost. They have them set on specific dates. So they don't have the flexibility of having an election whenever they want, but they fall into certain dates on a calendar. So we run under an election consolidation model at the county level. The Secretary of State's office in Idaho puts the guardrails on the highway, so to speak, from which the states then choose their lane in order to go forward. And that's where, when you look at the Constitution, the Secretary of State, both constitutionally and statutorily, is tasked with maintaining consistency in the application of the election laws, but not dictating which of those particular processes a county will use. And that plays out the same at the federal level, in that we don't have federal interference in state elections, and they, in all honesty, exercise very little judgment and very little control over federal elections, even other than the UOCAVA, Uniform Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, and the Help America Vote Act, both of which were targeted towards registration requirements to allow people to be eligible to vote, not necessarily how they vote from that point. Does that help answer your question?
Yep.
So we're going to take a look at basic election processes. And these, again, are very high level buckets that you can use to categorize eras or timelines or segments of the election system. The first thing you do when you get into an election is, we just mentioned it a moment ago, you have election registration. It's a very large process. It's very all-encompassing and done differently in different states. There is the Help America Vote Act and the National Voter Registration Act that both govern these, and they both have some exemptions in them. So states still have a level of variability. Idaho, for example, is exempt from the National Voter Registration Act because, or some of the components of it, because we have a standing election day registration statute that predates the act. And as a result, we weren't held or encompassed in that act. It's one of the grandfather clause exemptions. There's only about 6 states that have those. So not a completely homogeneous bucket, slightly differentiated, but by and large, most of the states run under the same game plans there. About 5 or 6 have some variables. Once you've got someone registered, in order to vote, they've got to request a ballot. Now, you may think if you voted and you voted in person that you don't really remember going through this step. Well, it was when you walked up and checked in. You were requesting your ballot there. If you're in a state that deals with absentee voting, you're requesting your ballot either by mail or in person or online. There's any number of different processes that we could use there. But in all cases, in order to get a ballot, you request it. Now, one of those scenarios in a handful of states is as soon as you registered, you automatically requested your ballot functionally in perpetuity because they mail by default and they mail to the entire registration list. So in some states, this process happens tied in with the registration process. Once you've requested your ballot, it's got to be transmitted to you. Most common means of doing that is handing it to you over a counter. Okay, but that's still a ballot transmission process. And is there room for fraud in that process? Arguably, yes. Is there room for error in that process? Absolutely. I could give you the wrong ballot. In any given polling location, there may be multiple ballots. There may be multiple rotations of that ballot. There may be separate ballots for taxing districts. If I fail to give you all of them, you didn't get adequate representation for what you're being taxed. So there is room, even in ballot transmission, for problems, even if it's just over the counter. Once it's been transmitted to you, you mark it. That one's a pretty common thought process, pretty understood. Again, you got to look at all the different venues in which it's in play. And believe it or not, this is one that's hugely being argued right now. Ballot marking is being debated because the question is, should we allow people to do that electronically? Electronic ballot marking is a question of, does the machine show me what it's actually saying I did in the back end? Is there a way to counter or visibly guarantee that what it's recording is what I'm saying, what I wanted? So there's a big debate there on ballot marking, and especially electronic ballot marking devices. Which kind of leads into the next one, ballot return and verification. If it's coming back by mail from an absentee ballot, is what I'm getting back an authentic ballot? And is it the ballot that I sent out? Is it a replicated ballot? Is it a false ballot? Was it photocopied? Was it somehow reproduced? Was it even ever sent out in the first place? Right? Is it authentic? When you've taken it over the counter and you went into a ballot booth and marked it and you walked it out in your own hands and you put it into a tabulating machine, it's pretty well understood to be authentic. Is it always the case? Not necessarily. The machines are using XY coordinate marks, specific marks on the ballot to validate and authenticate that ballot as it's being put in the machine before it's being tabulated. So that process is still going on. A lot of these things happening in the background, we don't even think about them, but they're there. That gets us to tabulation and reconciliation. The tabulation process, obviously counting, the reconciliation process, sometimes simultaneously done, but reconciliation, again, is making sure that the number of ballots we issued, the number of voters we've handled, equals the number of ballots that we have cast, because we have 1 vote per person in the United States. It's not vote early, vote often. It's supposed to be vote once and make sure it counts. Okay, and then finally, when all of those things are done, we go to a non-voter process called canvassing and certification. And that's that internal audits that happen at the county level, at the jurisdictional level, at the taxing district level, to make sure that all of the things that went on beforehand line up with the other records, the cross checks, the verification methods that we have, whatever they are, to make sure that the numbers are correct before we say, yes, this is an official result. This is what the people said. So that's the election system. If we look at it, can you further define it? Can you break it down? Can you find subsystems within each of the major buckets? Yes, but this is high level enough. We can use this as an overlay in almost any state. And if we started here in a discussion by walking in as an advisor or a consultant, we could say, how do you do registration? How do you do ballot request? How do you do ballot transmission? What mechanisms of transmission are allowable by law in your state? This is a distilled enough system that we can get something meaningful out of it. And yet, if we're zeroing in on processes, now it lets us know where, right? So in this case, we can come in and we can say, we're trying to solve this risk, mitigate this threat, and it exists across these domains or in this domain specifically. Because of that, we can be a lot more effective and efficient in how we analyze. So let's play a little fact or fiction here. Fact or fiction, fake ballots can be seen with a forensic blacklight. Fact or fiction? I mean, maybe, but if it was that easy, it's a dumb crook, right? This kind of popped up because we saw people scanning ballots with black lights in Arizona during the Arizona audit. They never really clearly articulated beforehand what they were looking for. No one really knew what it was. You just mentioned fibers, so why not? Stuffing the ballot box is a common problem in US elections. That's where the fiber question comes in, because the fibers comment was, we're looking for bamboo fibers. And if it's bamboo fibers in the paper, then it was obviously produced in China. And if the ballot came from China, it's obviously international meddling, which alludes to ballot box stuffing, okay? Now you had to go through 3 things to get there. But nonetheless, that's an actual argument that people are buying right now. So how do you, if this is what's being delivered to you, how do you solve that problem? Do you go after a machine that doesn't allow for bamboo fibers? It kind of seems like, I mean, that's an undefined problem with an infinite number of solutions, one of which might be to reject anything with a bamboo fiber in it, right? But what if suddenly we decide that bamboo is one of the best fibers to use for paper and we start printing on bamboo paper? Is that insane? No, we use it for flooring. I mean, we use it, it's one of the most renewable types of wood there is. So what problem is stuffing a ballot box actually, where does that actually fall? Well, it falls in that reconciliation, tabulation kind of bucket, right? And what you're dealing with, if this is the issue you're trying to counter in the public space, what you're dealing with is a failure of ballot inventory controls. You don't know how many ballots you're supposed to have, so you don't know how many ballots you're supposed to count. So someone might be able to sneak ballots in without your knowledge. Otherwise, your inventories ought to send red flags up all over the place. We saw this happen actually in the last election here in Idaho, where we had a county that, as they were going through and they had published their unofficial results the previous night, it was about 4 in the morning by the time they got that process done. We're asking individuals to do their best work after 18 sleepless, stressful hours. Probably not the smartest thing in the world, but that's the statutory layout of the system right now. There's room for improvement there, granted, okay? But at that point, they said, yep, these are the numbers, everything's good, we're good. Press print. And the unofficial results went up. That's why we leave them unofficial. Came back in the next morning, they started looking at their reconciliation. They started going through some of their checks and balances. And they said, wait a minute, we look like we're about 250 ballots shy. Our inventories aren't lining up. The number in the box, the number in the totals doesn't reconcile with the number of voters that cast ballots in this election, and we can prove it. And because of that, they started looking, okay, where could it come from? Because the numbers on the tabulators lined up with the number of ballots tabulated. So by looking at that, they were able to say, then we must have not tabulated them all. They went to the vault. They started examining the boxes. They found a box that was still sealed. The fact that it was still sealed and undisrupted alluded to the fact that they had not opened it. If they had not opened it, they had not tabulated it. They went into a process of making sure that they were going to do it in a very public and transparent manner. So they coordinated and timed and got representatives from both parties to show up. They opened that box in the presence of witnesses. They had a process in place where the number on the seal had been attested to by an affidavit on the bottom of that box that was the first piece of paper in that box, if they followed their processes right. So when they cut that seal, they immediately went to the bottom of the box, took out all the ballots, found the affidavit, compared it to the seal. It matched up. Nobody disrupted anything. Now with their integrity intact, they tabulated those ballots, added it up, and the election added up. That's an excellent example of a good process, good checks and balances, but the fact that they are there, that makes a comment like stuffing the ballot box is a common problem. No, it's a reasonable threat, but one that has several controls for which we have heavily mitigated by interlacing controls.
The story you're telling, isn't there a punchline? It changed the results.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did. That is the unfortunate punchline. In one race, it did change the results. That's why we tell people don't quit your job over the unofficial results, because they're not official for actually several days afterwards. 7 to 10 days for the counties to do their checks, depending on whether it's primary or general in Idaho. And then from that, the state has 7 days to take anything. And in this case, this was one of those cases. You had a multi-county jurisdiction, a legislative district that spanned 3 counties. So that doesn't actually become official until the state then takes each of the county's numbers and reconciles them back against ours and adds it all up, makes it official in the final. So absolutely. How about this one? Long waits at the polls discourage people to exercise their franchise. Fact or fiction? Absolute fact. The longer the line, the higher the likelihood that someone's going to get out of that line and go home. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And we don't have unlimited resources, so we have to try and, that's a realistic problem that we could try and solve. But to do that, what do you need to do? Is that a root cause or a symptom? It's a symptom. You got to find the root cause, which means we've got to distill, right? We've got to go through processes to get there. Is that the problem? No, but do we have to do some research to get to the root of the problem? Absolutely. So there's work involved in getting down to that. That's actually one of the problems being worked on right here, right? Let's get one more. Voter rolls aren't clean. People vote twice, and there's even dead people voting. Fact or fiction?
Fiction, and I can prove.
Half and half.
I was gonna say there are instances.
Half and half. Voter rolls aren't clean. True. They are not perfect. And they're an ongoing moving target. They're a constantly evolving data set. People come in, people go out, people change names. It is a dynamic data set at minimum. To say that's kind of an understatement, right? But people vote twice and there's even dead people voting. Again, there's a lot of controls in place that help do that, that help make sure that can't happen, or that if it does happen, that they get caught. And we're doing some work to try and improve even upon that. So let's take a look at those real quick. This is in practice here. Reducing long waits, we'll take a look at that first. Can we better define what's causing the long wait? That's the first piece of that problem. As we started looking at that, some of our amazing students here at BSU came to the conclusion there's poor or no incident management data across, not only here in Idaho, but across the ecosystem as a whole. Very few states have very solid processes to track incident management data so that we can look at that data so we can see where the problem lies. And in that case, that created an opportunity. We were trying to distill down on this question of what's causing it, came to the realization that no one knows, came to the realization that no one's collecting the data, saw an opportunity to collect the data, right? So actually in distilling, that was one of the waste products, right? That's a waste product that turned into a good opportunity for us to look at. So now we're working on developing an incident management tool that tracks that for down at the municipal level, and adding to that, realizing that again, in defining, we had an issue. In order for the tool to work, the person using the tool had to have enough of an understanding to correctly categorize the problem they were trying to deal with. And when we took our first attempt at it, we said, we're just going to give them a 1 to 5 severity level. But the problem is you're talking about volunteers that don't understand the kind of the variations. They don't have the inherent understanding to quantify that well. Is this a 3, a 4, a 5? What's a 1? What does it look like? How bad is this? So we went to something that's a little more kind of common. We went to low, medium, high. And then we looked at the category it was in, and with low, medium, high, against a matrix of the different category itself, we assign a 1 through 5 value to it. What that allowed is for things that are low importance, but high severity within that bucket, they might come out a 3. Their low is a 1, their medium is a 2, their high is a 3. But all in all, that's not going to, even at a high, that's not going to significantly impact the election. On the other hand, something that might be a low, the power's out, but it's only out right here. It's not a statewide power outage. So that might be a low on power outage, but a low power outage is still pretty important. We still got to deal with that. So that might start at a 3 and escalate all the way to a 5, for example. Okay. Some examples of some of the things that have come out of that piece here at Boise State. Again, by better understanding the nature of the incidents that occur, we'll be able to better define the root cause problems. Then we can start looking at individual ways to assess each of those individual problems. But first, we got to have data to look at. In order to have the data, we got to collect that data. If as a benefit of that, we can give them a better tool to manage their incidents, and in that tool in and of itself, improve communication speed, we might be able to cut down on the amount of time it takes them to mitigate. Let's talk about the voter rolls real quick, then we'll wrap up. Problem on this one, lack of adequate and broadly acceptable registration list management and comparison tools. Not a perfectly defined problem statement, but it's a good starting point. It was called Crosscheck. There was a tool that was in use by the state of Idaho and several others about 4 years ago. Unfortunately, it got stuck in a lawsuit, got pulled down. States were left with very little to no options. There was one other out in the marketplace, but because of what it is and how it operates, many states, including Idaho, didn't want to participate. I mentioned the exemption that we have to the Help America Vote Act. Jumping into this particular tool would basically cause us to let go of all of our exemptions, not from a federal standpoint, but the things that the tool would require us to do. We'd be doing things that that the federal government doesn't even require us to. So giving up that autonomy to handle things ourselves was a little bit too much for us. So we started looking at, go ahead.
I think the big problem you're not mentioning with the tool is the processes are hidden. It's not transparent. So if you ask them what algorithms you're using, how you're comparing, finding stuff, they don't release it. So now we're testing the whole voter registration system on this program that's not available. It should be open source. Right? So that was a big.
So that's another, you're right. That's absolutely another big challenge is it's built on a trust us model. We got this, trust us. We're from the government, we're here to help. Except it's not government.
It's not even government. I'm a random person.
We work for the government, we're here to help. So the alternative needs to be flexible, it needs to be faster, it needs to be less demanding, and as Ahmed just mentioned, it needs to be open. It needs to be transparent. And that is a big piece of this project, is developing something that anyone can look at, anyone can validate to, anyone can reproduce. Not necessarily anyone's going to have the same data sets, but they should be able to reproduce results in a similar manner with what we've got. And that's the goal and the objective here. So this current effort, at this point, we're analyzing state A voter registration data against itself. Okay. Preparing for the addition of state B data and testing the effectiveness of various algorithms against those data. That's where this one is at presently, and really looking forward to it. We have several states that are actually interested in coming on board as soon as we have that available. And you heard this a lot in the 2022 elections. Louisiana was one of the first states to pull out of the other program. Just as recently as yesterday, the state of Alabama, the new secretary-elect from Alabama, publicly announced that he plans on pulling the state of Alabama out of the other program. Several folks campaigned on that. If they were elected, they would be removing their state from the other program. Not here to name names, so no point in that one. But great opportunities coming up here with this one. So with that, there we go. I had my sequencing off. Proper mitigation can only follow proper definition. If we're summing this all up and you only write one thing down, this is my recommendation to you. Determine the symptom versus the root cause when you look at something. Distill your issues down as much as you can. Pay attention to what you come across, what you both have as waste and value in that process, because both of them may be valuable to you at some point in time. Detail what's known and what's not known, because in both of those cases, and if we look back on the data collection component, we went out looking for what are the kinds of incidents you deal with, and the answer was that's not known. So that became the project in and of itself. Can we define what's going on? Can we collect that data? Can we build a data set? And then finally, just decrease your scope whenever you can, as much as you can, because it will allow you to actually achieve victories along the way. You'll actually solve a problem, which is fun and meaningful and useful. And once you've solved that problem, you can step into looking at the other problem. You can go back and look at some of the things that you distilled off, and you may have the next problem waiting to be solved right there. Decrease your scope, address one problem, then move on, instead of trying to do everything all at once. So with that, I am going to jump into Q&A with anyone.